You feeling stuck lately? Like life's passing you by? Get to know M.A.Y.A.
Acronym, My Ambition, Your Ambition.
Reconnect with your dreams, your goals, your ambitions. Find your motivation and start to live the life you desire. Explore the M.A.Y.A, My Ambition, Your Ambition podcast at M.A.Y.A.com.
Namaste, everyone. Welcome to M.A.Y.A, My Ambition, Your Ambition. This is episode 38. I'm looking forward to this. Everything is tying together as we are in the midst of Stress Awareness Month. That's what April is. So I figured why not add another topic to the mix that you can put into your toolbox, or at least add some perspective to when you're trying to deal with stress. So we're going to be talking a bit about fear. Ooh, something that's uncomfortable and people don't like to acknowledge until it's dead smack in their face. We're going to find a way to deal with that. But before we do all that, of course, if you are new to the show, welcome aboard. As I always say, buckle up for safety. Not that obviously this is a safe space, but occasionally it can get a little bit bumpy along the way, because I may say something that may jar a memory, give you a thought of something you've never really thought about. And of course, if you're a returning viewer or listener, you know exactly the routine. I always suggest, hey, grab a piece of paper, a pen, jot down, take some notes, some things that kind of pop in your head. You go, you know something? I really hadn't thought about that, but that's worth a little bit more reflection. Now, we know there's a rule of thumb with M.A.Y.A that we are up to 38 episodes. You're working at your pace. So if you're still back in episode 24 that talked about comfort zones, then guess what? It's okay. But if you're here right now with me, I greatly appreciate that every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time, you want to be right at the beginning of whatever I'm talking about. Thank you and welcome aboard for being here. Before we jump into, obviously, episode 38, the factor of fear, we got to do our housekeeping stuff first, which means obviously you can listen to past episodes because we now have 38 of them. And I always encourage people to start in the beginning, not because I'm trying to encourage you to listen to all my episodes, but they have by accident built upon each other. And I feel each episode kind of helps with that growing and reflection piece, because, you know, everything about M.A.Y.A is getting to that best version of you every single day. Harnessing happiness every single day. Part of 2021, our approach is we're not thinking about lofty goals of the best version of me, because we realize that it is quantitative things and the qualitative time you put into it that turns into that big version of you. So it's little things, incremental things that we're working on to help you to get to that masterful version of yourself that, you know what, every day you can wake up and say, I'm really feeling good about where I'm at right now in my life. I'm happy. That's what M.A.Y.A is all about. So you work at your own pace, and that's good. So remember, you can find previous episodes of M.A.Y.A at M.A.Y.A.com. Remember, every episode pretty much has a podcast companion, which means additional information you can read up on the subject we're talking about. So you just go to M.A.Y.A.com, then you click on podcast resource, that tab, go to the episode, and then you can look into some of the additional things that I have added that I'm looking to help you expand the conversation beyond just the podcast. Hopefully by now you have subscribed to my YouTube channel. It's M.A.Y.A. I said you type it in. And to your probably surprise, a whole bunch of things are going to pop up to say M.A.Y.A. A lot of it's anime, Japanese anime. So it's okay. Just scroll down and then you'll find me and then click subscribe. I appreciate that. But if you happen to have a podcast platform of choice, I don't hold it against people. However you're listening to the podcast, I greatly appreciate it. It doesn't matter, but you can always find episodes of M.A.Y.A on iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Amazon Audible, Spotify. You can find me in all of those places. So if that's how you prefer to listen to the podcast, thumbs up. Just do me a favor. Make sure you subscribe there as well. Hopefully by now, everybody has gotten social with me, which means you're following me on Instagram and Twitter, Maya_Kai, and Facebook, Maya Kai Presents. You know, I'm trying to separate out, my multiple identities I've got going, because some people know me from the sports standpoint. So this is, for some people, a little new, but this is really who I am when I'm not masquerading like I'm, the sportscaster. But I do have a history with that. So I like to keep things a little bit separate as much as I can, but I like to share because it's all about who I am. So those are all the ways you can connect with the show, find previous episodes. Remember, it's important to work at your own pace. For the next 60 minutes, this is you and me time. I like to tell people I am your friendly, neighborhood mental health advocate. This isn't being in therapy. This is about information I can share with you to help you to get to that best version of yourself. And at some point, if you decide that maybe you need something a little bit more in regards to maybe talking to someone and you discovered it here, that's even better. I have no complaints about that. So just make sure that whatever it is, you're getting the most from every single podcast, which means the 60 minutes. Find that quiet time if you can. You might be listening to me, because you're towards the end of your day, whatever the case may be. I always say grab your beverage of choice. For me, I'm drinking green tea, trying to detox and be healthy, as we're moving into like getting closer to summer and all this good stuff. But of course, coffee, tea, it's 5 o'clock someplace. So maybe you'll have a glass of wine. Big ups to all my listeners in places like Morocco. That's pretty cool. I got a couple people in Egypt. Appreciate everybody tuning in and sharing and asking different questions. If I ever say something and it kind of jars a thought for you, feel free to, send me a message on, Facebook or on my website. You can send in emails as well and say, hey, Maya, you said something. I have a quick question about this. I'm more than willing to engage in that. Also, a lot of the interaction I get back from people who listen to the podcast, I legitimately kind of take their thoughts and think about what the next or future episodes will be. So your input and what I do here is greatly appreciated. Don't forget, if you want to get interactive with the show, like many people know how to do, Roburn, who is in Hawaii, aloha, always tunes in. All you do is have to type into the comment section, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube, and boom, I can share your comments right there on the screen with everybody. So just make sure that you go ahead and share your thoughts. Hello, James O'Bannon. And I can share it with everybody. So if you're viewing, obviously you can read it, but if you're just listening, that's okay too. I'll make sure that I read it and share what you're saying. So let's go ahead and jump into episode 38. I feel like sometimes I jump into stuff with people and they get a little uncomfortable with it because, I always say before you can get comfortable and really thrive and grow, you're going to have to be comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable. That episode about comfort zones, which is 24, I'll kind of reference that a couple times in the show, is key to make you understand that it can be obviously a safety net, but it also can be a hindrance in getting to where you need to be. Fear is the same type of construct, so to speak. And the reason I felt like I had to talk about it because this is National Stress Awareness Month. And last week we talked about stress. Well, guess what? It's interesting because something that kind of goes hand in hand when you talk about stress and it being mounting and all the effects that it has is when you talk about things like fear and anxiety, and fear usually tend to go hand in hand. So I wanted to make sure we had a little talk about fear because we have talked about anxiety. And if we're trying to figure out ways for people to be able to manage their stress better, so it doesn't turn into all the other issues we talked about last week, then obviously dealing with fear is paramount at this point. And fear is different for different people. That's what's so important. Remember, this is not a one-size-fits-all show. Some people may feel they really have no mental health issues or mental wellness issues. Some people may have mental health issues. Some people may be dealing more with mental wellness, maintaining, being able to deal with the day-to-day things that makes life complicated. So I always say there's different domains when you talk about, mentality. But on the show, we look at working in all those domains. Mentally, emotionally, we talk about physically, financially, and spiritually, if that happens to be part of what encompasses who you are. So we talk about that mental wellness within all those domains because they're interconnected. So fear is one of those things that's really interesting. Now, before we start the show, what's key? What do we always have to do? We have to open up the toolbox, Maya. And what are we taking out, Maya? We're taking out our emotional intelligence. It's front and center every single episode. And hopefully by now, because it is the most important tool that we have put into your toolbox, hopefully it's front and center with you every time you wake up and begin your day. Hopefully you wake up with your emotional intelligence and you're saying, today feels good. Or do you wake up on that day and realize that you woke up on the wrong side of the bed? And the minute you can acknowledge, I'm feeling some kind of way, and maybe it was a continuation from the night before, that emotional intelligence helps you to be in touch with how you feel, because it gives you that ability to perceive, control, and evaluate how you feel, as well as dealing with others. So we have our EI out on the table, and that's going to be really important in this episode, as with every episode. So let's jump into episode 38. How does fear factor into your life? Well, you know me, I'm really big on semantics. So let's just jump right into talking about, what is fear? I feel before you can really have comprehensive conversations about things, they need to have framework. Now, mind you, that could be because I work in obviously the field of in mental health, but my training is more on the psychological side opposed to the social work side. You should know that. Within the scope of mental wellness or mental health, there's lots of different practitioners that do different things. My background happens to be in psychology. My training is in counseling based in psychology versus training that could be based and social work. Both are equally as important and serve purposes for different people at different times and different stages. And either way, if you end up getting a competent counselor, no matter whether they're based in social work or psychology, it doesn't matter because they're going to be good at what they do. But I just kind of want to give some background for me being in the field for like 20 years. My background is psychology based. So sometimes I tend to get a little theory heavy because I enjoy those things. But I think it gives you insight to a different side of how you think, because obviously psychology is strongly cognitive based, behavioral, and emotional. Okay, so let's flat out just talk about what fear is. What's key about fear is I think it's important to talk about it in the two realms that it exists. Fear can be looked at as that noun, which is saying it's an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous and likely to cause pain, or it's a threat. So it makes it a noun. It's an unpleasant emotion. What's interesting about fear to me, and where I think it crosses into a very complicated domain, is when it turns into a verb. Whereas to be afraid of someone or something because it might be dangerous, painful, or threatening. So it exists as here is fear. And when it goes into action, it's like now here's fear in action. So you may have a fear of something, but haven't developed that you're not afraid. You're like kind of concerned about this. That's why I think language and that internal talk we talk about is really important, because how you choose to personify fear is interesting. You can flat out say, I'm really concerned about this situation over here. It makes me really uneasy. And you can feel that physiological response kind of coming up that we like. Anxiety looks a lot like everything, but how we choose to personify fear is important. That's why I gave you this really small nuance of looking at fear as a noun, as an unpleasant emotion that's caused by a belief, versus when it gets into action, you then become afraid of it. Two different things. And depending upon where you are with a certain issue that you have fear with, I think one of the most important evaluation pieces is to say, is it just right now a construct and an idea that I'm struggling with that makes me really uncomfortable? Or has it really transitioned into, I am legitimately afraid and my actions are being modified because of how I feel about it? That's the framework that we are putting fear into. Note, fear is different than phobia. And like I said, I know this isn't sexy conversation for people, but I'll tell you what, fear has turned into some difficult things for a lot of people because they don't want to acknowledge. It's so easy to turn our head the opposite way and not acknowledge we struggle with things legitimately because at the core of what they are, they're based in something. And the reason they can be reoccurrent is because we're in denial. One of those ego mechanisms that Freud talked about. It's like you do something to try to like deal with it. And sometimes the way you choose to deal with it, and if denial is your route, then generally speaking, it's going to be a problem. And repression is even worse, where you just totally forget that it happened. You block it out until it resurfaces because something trigger or activates a memory for you. So note that fear is different than a phobia. And real talk. This is where fear becomes a dangerous thing to a degree, because a phobia is like this excessive, it's a rational fear, so to speak. And it's a panic reaction to a situation. But phobias are usually like living creatures, places, or objects. So you hear phobias all the time. You will hear people talk about having a fear of heights. That's a phobia. It's a very specific thing. You have some people that have a fear of spiders, arachnophobia. You may have people who have a fear of getting out into large crowds of people. They don't like interacting with people. It's referred to as agoraphobia. Hence, all those things have phobia. And the list of phobias are so long, I can't even tell you how many there are. On the flip side, a phobia, when it gets to be not fearful, but a need and a desire, turns into a fetish. So that's a whole nother conversation, and we'll probably never have an episode about fetishes. And no one asked me to do so because I'd have to probably go back and get Yanni Brown to talk with me about that, because I'm sure her conversation about that would help to enrich the whole conversation we would try to have. But just know, if you've gotten to the point where something legitimately is debilitating, like some people, I've seen people literally be afraid of needles, and I can't remember what needle phobia is called. And they like start to scream, to yell, to cry, and actually get combative because the fear is so great towards even someone coming towards them with a needle. It's interesting. So Let's talk about specifically in more detail. Now that we know what a fear is versus a phobia, and now we know how we choose to approach fear, how we personify it is important. Is it just an emotion or something that makes us uncomfortable, or does it make us literally afraid? It elicits that emotion to a different level. So now that we know the framework that we can put fear into, let's talk about what makes fear a factor. Well, the way I'm going to break this down for you is there's two things that make fear into a factor. Because understand, from a standpoint, fear can have purpose just like anxiety does. It can prepare you, it can kind of be your spidey senses going off, and that's different because it's unconditional. But to me, fear can function in two areas that I want you to think about. Fear can be something that is more of a determination. It drives you. So it provides this initiative to protect oneself, as well as what we love, what we cherish, or hold to a high regard. So with determination, it's not so much you know what the issue is, and it's more fear as a noun than it is fear as being that verb. So it's like, look, here's this situation. I know this is difficult. I know there's risk. I may not like the outcome, because the unknown is part of the thing that drives fear, so to speak. And you may say that to yourself, but because you value your life or loved ones or something that could be jeopardized by it, that fear makes you act in a way to be protective of interest. That's when fear is not negative, when it's a call to action to protect something of interest because you know there's risk. On the flip side of that, fear can be a deterrent, and this is when it becomes an issue, especially if it's ongoing. A deterrent, it becomes something that discourages you from doing something that you desire to do. It hinders your progress, your growth, and your happiness, because there's something about it that you feel the risk is so great, you're not willing to take that step forward. That determination does not spur you to want to do more. That's when you can say, this is an issue, especially if it becomes a reoccurring issue. So I've put fear into two domains for you. It becomes a factor, whether it's a determination that can drive you, or is it a deterrent that keeps you from being able to move forward because the risk or the outcome or the fear of the pain or whatever the case may be will not let you even begin to engage in a way to come out of your comfort zone. That word will be said a whole lot through this show, comfort zone. There's a movie, and I had to share this clip because the movie was absolutely garbage. And I say this, and Will Smith is like one of my favorite people. Two, I am a huge sci-fi person, and I will tell you, to create sci-fi that does not look generic or hokey is hard. So you look at some of your best sci-fi stuff like Aliens, Predator, things like that. To construct that type of storyline with that type of entity is really hard to do. So the movie is After Earth, and it starred Will and his son Jaden. And believe it or not, the concept wasn't bad. It just turned out that either the acting piece didn't work or it just wasn't fleshed out enough. But we're not here to talk about the synopsis of why I thought the movie was bad. But this scene, there was actually two scenes in this movie that stuck with me. When he talked about fear, and there was a scene about sacrifice in the movie that really hit home for me. And I was like, that's sacrifice. A sacrifice that was unexpected. Now I'm going to prompt you to go watch this awful movie, but the whole movie is based on fear. So if you want to kind of get an idea of how fear can be so debilitating, that movie would be interesting. I'm not saying you're going to enjoy it, but it would be some perspective. So in the movie After Earth, Will Smith, who was injured on the planet with his son, at this point, Earth has been abandoned and has gone back to its natural state. Everything is running wild and amok, so to speak. And they end up crashing on the planet. Will is injured and has to rely on his son to do something for them to survive beyond this. And his son is afraid. And this is how he talks about fear. Take a listen.
Fear is not real. The only place that fear can exist is in our thoughts of the future. It is a product of our imagination, causing us to fear things that do not at present and may not ever exist. That is near insanity, Qatar. Now, do not misunderstand me. Danger is very real, but fear is a choice. We are all telling ourselves a story.
powerful because he says a lot of things that some people are going to instantly want to contest about fear. It's not a choice. Of course it is. It's a hard choice. It's a very difficult choice. It's one that may call upon you to do more than you ever expected that you could, but it still is a choice. It is not rooted necessarily in the present, but is the concern for future outcomes of something because you're aware that it may not be easy, it may be painful, it may be undesired, it may be uncomfortable. But fear is projection of what the future may hold. And it's interesting how so many people will miss out on opportunity because they're so afraid, they're fearful of what that opportunity may look like. Because they sometimes will focus more on the risk and the negative than they will of the positive of what the outcome could be. Very, very powerful scene. And it really sat with me because I said, that's really true. It is a choice. And everything about our lives is a narrative. It's a story. And I always say to people, that's why I'm a big fan of narrative therapy, that when you start to tell your story and you put together your storyline, and there's a backstory to everything and you put characters in and you say how some characters have interacted with others and kind of how the story unfolded, you might start to do things differently because you have a perspective on something that you've never seen it. But it is your story. And at any point of time, you can choose. You can't rewrite a scene because we can't relive mistakes, but we can definitely write future scenes differently as long as we don't look at the changes we have to make as fear. Very powerful, awful, awful movie. I'm going to tell you that. But that scene, along with one other scene, was deep and very thoughtful. A movie based on fear is what the whole thing is about. So podcast threading is something I've been doing for like the last couple episodes because I wasn't intentionally building episodes to work together, but for some reason, it's just been working out that way. So the podcast thread for this week is in episode 37, we talked about stress. As I said, April is National Stress Awareness Month. How mentally, emotionally, and physically it can manifest itself in ways that begin to affect your health. Fear is a companion of stress. Fear is a companion of anxiety. Stress does not manifest simply because it just comes out of a vacuum of non-existence. It comes from the construct in our minds of things that we are dealing with and how we choose to deal with them. And generally speaking, there is a form of fear that generates stress responses. So there's a lot of hand-holding with negative things like fear loves anxiety and anxiety loves fear. And all of a sudden they like to invite depression to the party. And believe it or not, this is all something that you're constructing that I'm not saying your situation isn't impacting you, but it's how you're choosing to perceive the situation is what it comes down to. And that's difficult because I'm always asking people to start to think differently. But the first thing, along with your emotional intelligence, that I'm challenging you to do is start to have a different internal conversation. If you're talking to yourself, it's not wrong. If you're answering yourself, that's not necessarily wrong either. That does not mean you're crazy. That's another one of those strange things we say when people talk to themselves, they're crazy. Well, no, it's different if you're talking to yourself and you think there's somebody else there. But when the audience is a captive audience and it's you, because you're putting yourself in check, like you knew you weren't supposed to do that because the consequence was going to be this. The affirmation turns into, yeah, you're right. And that does not mean you think there's another person there. It means that you are holding yourself accountable. And holding yourself accountable means mentally processing what's happening, and often putting things into words calls things into action. That's why I tell people, don't be afraid to stand in the mirror, talk to yourself about what's going on with yourself. Look yourself in the eyes and say, are you really okay with this? Why are you accepting this behavior from someone else? Better yet, why are you behaving this way? Don't you think or feel you are better than this? Look yourself in the face and call yourself out. It's the best part of self-therapy and self-help you can ever do because you have to look at yourself and hold yourself accountable. But those internal conversations is something I want people to start having and not feeling like it's weird or it's odd or I'm talking to myself. Yes, you are, because you're trying to work with yourself to process and figure some things out. And often when we give things form by words, the meaning of it is so much richer and easier to capture. All right. Let's jump into our real talk time, the first one of the show. There'll be two toolbox times two. As a matter of fact, they pretty much go back to back because they're working together. I kind of talked about this a little bit when we looked at the clip from After Earth with Will Smith. The question I'd put on the table for you is this. Are you allowing stress and fear to be the driver in your life? And are you riding shotgun? Worse, in the back seat. I want you to think about that. How easy do you surrender to something? Because there is the fear of what it may require for you to do. Nothing worth having ever comes easy. My grandma used to say that. May she rest in peace. Everything that glitters isn't gold. She used to say that too. And as a kid, I'd be like, what? Over time, both of those sayings made sense. That anything truly worth having may require a certain degree of work. Because if everything that was really of value was easy to achieve and have, wouldn't everybody have it? Just a thought. Think on that. If it was meant for everybody to have everything because it was just meant to be that way, then it would be that way. But clearly we know that certain things require more work. And yes, it is unfortunate, and it really almost is insane that to be able to achieve and harness happiness takes so much work. But unfortunately, the world that we live in has created this type of environment that it's made it more complicated than it should be. I will tell you that. I don't feel that the struggle to self-actualize should be so hard. To be able to have happiness should be so hard. But we live in this world that has put these constraints in place that do that. And the key part of working towards that best version of you is learning how to unbuckle this. But more importantly, understanding what is the right fit for you, because everything that is abound in this world is not meant to fit to your soul, to your spirit, to your mind, to your energy. So don't always think that one size fits all was supposed to be appropriate for you. And I think more people spend time trying to fit themselves into things they assume where they should be, opposed to saying, well, maybe I want something that's a little bit more tailor-made to my emotions. Maybe I want something a bit more tailor-made to the way I think. Because we have so many things that incorporate who we are, and we're unique creatures. Every single one of us are unique in our own way. And while we try to keep making concessions to make ourselves fit into something because we feel that's how we should, well, do you feel that way because that's how you want to feel? Or do you feel that way because we live in a society that is trying to dictate to you that is the way you should feel? But that's another episode. But when you're fearful to even begin to have these type of thoughts and these internal conversations, it's hard to figure out what you need and what you want if you won't explore it. Because self-exploration, you can start unpacking a lot of stuff and get a little nervous. Like, why is this still in the box? I thought I got rid of that. It's okay. A little purging, seasonally purging emotionally and mentally is a good thing to do. That would be a great episode. How to focus on emotionally and mentally purging along with the seasons. So whatever crap you collected over spring, don't take it into summer. And though summer can be fun and we like to be out in the fresh air and the sunshine, and generally it's probably one of the healthiest times. It does not usually fall into seasonal affective disorder for most people because the vitamin D we're getting from the sun is fantastic. Tends to be the better times. It's when we get into those seasons where it's colder weather, not as much sun, that we tend to kind of struggle a bit. And even if people don't have seasonal affective disorders, they'll be like, I got cabin fever. I need to get out. I need something different. So to me, seasonally purging things that maybe you collected isn't a bad idea. Like, hey, I collected this over the summer, but does it really need to go with me the rest of the year? Nah, I think I'll leave that back here and keep moving. Purging is healthy. But we like to keep and collect. It's like we're emotionally hoarders sometimes. And I will tell you this, I think a lot of people are emotional hoarders and not on purpose. That it just happens that we tend to keep a lot of stuff with us that we AKA like to call baggage. And it's because we've never thought about purging or unpacking it consistently. You would only do that in a material sense, that you wouldn't take on vacation if you were going someplace warm, but your last trip you packed for colder weather. You wouldn't just take that same suitcase with you and expect for what you had in that suitcase to work. So why emotionally and mentally do we use that behavior that isn't even normal and material behavior? It's interesting if we actually mimicked some of the things we do materially on an emotional and mental plane, we probably would start being happier. People consistently, people who are responsible, that is, get oil changes, take their cars to be washed. You will make sure in your house that you change filters, all kinds of stuff. We can be very vested in taking care of things materialistically, tangible things. But when it comes to those intangibles and that self-care and those things that are really focused on us, we tend to fall short often. I would tell you, I think it has a lot to do with we live in a world that really pushes materialism and not being in touch with oneself and not pushing self-care. You're hearing it more now, but it's not something that we've really, really been serious about. All right, so we talked about, are you allowing stress and fear to be driving your life? And you're riding shotgun. You're just in the middle like, whoa, I'm squeezed between fear and anxiety. And this is uncomfortable. Or one better, they just threw you in the back seat and say, shut up and ride. And you know what? You just shut up and ride. Because you know what? You're not even trying to talk to fear or challenge fear or think about fear. And you don't want to look at anxiety because you're kind of tired of feeling that way. So you're sitting back there in full discomfort because you're letting them be the driver. Just a real talk time. Think about it. As I said, after the first real talk time, we're going to move into a toolbox time. They're going to be equally yoked in the show, like back to back, because they just work in concert like that. So one of the things I keep reiterating, like the emotional intelligence piece, well, now the next tool that's going to constantly be like, you got to put this out, you got to put this on the table, it's important, is we're working at being objective. Putting things to side about how we feel about things and how we want things to be or how we see things. I'm not saying discount that, because I don't want you to feel like you ever have to discount your feelings. But I also need you to be able to step back and see the larger picture. You can see the forest for the trees thing. Because if you're only operating from a position of how you feel or what you think, you're not going to get real far. And I'm surprised you're even still listening to the podcast at this point, because you have to learn that striking a balance is so important in what we're trying to do. Balance is one of those things we're also working at putting in the toolbox. But balance comes from being able to consistently use your emotional intelligence and learning how to be objective all the time. How to look, listen, and evaluate is how we are fine-tuning our objective tool that we have in our toolbox. So when you talk about fear and anxiety, and remember we talked about fear as a noun and a verb, or it's just an emotion that sits, but when you become afraid of it, now it's action-oriented and it's driving. So I have to ask you that in your toolbox, you have to be able to know that fear is driving you and anxiety is also in the front seat with it, or you're between the two of them trying to figure out what to do. Be objective enough to say, this is my situation and this is why. Well, we'll dig into that a little bit later in the episode. But that's our toolbox. We got to take being objective on and put that on the table, and subjectivity has to be put to the side at this point, because subjectivity is the very thing that probably keeps you immersed in being fearful. Because it's me, and I feel this way. And okay, you might feel that way, but is there something bigger beyond the immediate fear you have of something that is beyond what you know? There are two types of fear. And this is what's key. And a lot of people can probably start to, if you're going to start to unpack stuff, like I said, we're purging seasonally. So all that stuff that maybe happened in spring, don't bring it in the summer. Enjoy your summer. So you start purging your spring stuff that wasn't good for you, spring cleaning. There should be seasonal cleaning, emotional and mental cleaning. But the thing I want you to think about is there's two different types of fears, and understanding where you fall with your fear is really important, because one is far more debilitating than the other. I mean, there is unconditional fear. And unconditional fear, and this gets into talking more about things like Pavlov and Skinner that were behavioralists, Pavlov's dog and things like that. But the key thing about unconditional fear is it's natural. It's one of those things that you're born with, and it's often rooted in preservation and sensing danger. So for instance, you see this in children frequently. They may see a dog barking. As adults, we know this, but this is when you don't know something. And because of how the dog is posturing, the child may instantly back away because that sense of fear is there. On the flip side, you have a child that knows nothing about vehicles and cars and could just want to cross the street to get to the park and walk across the street without knowing the danger that exists there. So over time, we begin to learn more about danger and what's something that we should be concerned about, because we don't have an innate sense of fear. We're not born with fear. Kids are very curious. That's part of the beauty of children, is their curiosity allows them to grow, because they'll go into things without being concerned. I always tell people, when you want to start your kids in certain sports like gymnastics, it's like fear is one of the hardest things to conquer in gymnastics, because there's so much things about control and restraint, and there's lots of ways that you can hurt yourself. But if you start a child at that young, they can grow into it. And that fear is not the same. So the thing about fear is that the unconditional fears, it's natural. It's like, I sense there might be danger here based on what I'm seeing, but there's nothing about it that you have history that tells you to feel differently. On the flip side, you have something that's a little different. You have, dealing with something that unfortunately could be more learned. And conditioned fear, on the flip side, is a learned response because something negative has happened in the past. So now you've become fearful. And what's interesting is that type of fear gives the experience power. Now, when I said fear, don't confuse it with danger. Danger, Will Robinson. When I say danger, I mean the things like examples, like you see a dog that's running loose. You like, this is probably not a good situation because I don't know if that dog is friendly. That's not fear. That's sensing danger and how you may have to respond. You may have a little bit of uncomfortability if, say, you're with friends and you're on a boating excursion and you're the one person on the boat that can't swim. So you feel a little uncomfortable. That's a justifiable fear because you realize you are surrounded around something called water that you can't necessarily deal with if push comes to shove. Danger is not a bad thing. It's innate to us to be able to sense situations that are not best suited for us or that could present issues that are not safe. But often, those fears where you're conditioned to be fearful of something, like I don't get into social conversations too often with people, but historically, there was a fear of different types of people. There was a fear of people of color, specifically Black men, that they were dangerous and that, they could hurt you. And that wasn't a fear that someone actually was unconditional. They were taught to fear someone based on misinformation and ignorance. And that's just a simple concept of fear. We can make children fearful of so many things without knowing it because they sense from us, we model to children what to be cognizant of, what's safe and not safe. And sometimes we insert things into the narrative for them that they don't need to be fearful of. It's interesting, one of the things about fear is you often will have people, and I've counseled people like this, that really have a fear of commitment. Ooh, we could have a whole episode on that. And their fear of commitment, to be honest, this doesn't apply to everybody, this applies to some people, is how they watched in their life so many unsuccessful or bad relationships happen. They legitimately are fearful to be in a committed relationship because they believe the outcomes will be the same. They now have learned behaviors from past experiences that makes them fearful that that's going to happen to them as well. But here's the thing about relationships. We know this is absolutely arbitrary. You do not have to emulate what you saw in the past that resulted in poor relationships or bad relationships. But sometimes the experience is so deep, you have people who can't get past it. So you see how fear can be this really tricky situation. It's like walking on a tightrope. That you're afraid that if I misstep, there's nothing below me except for death and despair, unless you're lucky and you see a safety net. And that's where you can approach fear and say, well, wait a minute, I do see something else there besides despair and danger. But we never discount danger because danger is absolutely different than fear. Okay, so we know there's two different types of fear. There's unconditional fear and there's conditional fear. Let's have another real talk time. Real talk time on this one. And this is one of those things I'm going to say, I got to pose a question again to you. Are you allowing stress and fear to be driving your life? Are you riding shotgun? Worse, are you in the back seat? So with that says, and I will say, I'll give a good example of why I say this to people. First of all, no one should have to ride shotgun in their own life. 2, you should not be in the back seat of your own life. And 3, you should absolutely be the driver. And if anything else is driving your life, and if it's fear, stress, depression, you have a problem, which means you are not navigating the path something else is. But before you can even make that change, you have to realize, where am I at in this journey? Am I the driver? Doesn't mean I don't make some bad choices. It doesn't mean I don't get off the road and I have an excursion that wasn't necessary, but I can get back on track. Or I'm literally just riding through my own life, having no control. That's the piece I'm going to say to you when I say real talk time. I need you to go back to it and I need you to think about it. So if you are a person that has a fear of failure or a fear of success, people think that's oxymoronic. How can you have a fear of success? So many people have it because failure does not seem to be an option to them. I'm going to tell you often where the fear of failure comes in. Again, I can always root this back to kids. If you did not have parents who did not explain to you what failure was, it might be a problem. You will not learn how to be successful. You will not learn how to grow unless you fail. Some of the most successful people failed miserably at tasks they were trying to complete, but they never gave up. It became a motivator. So what didn't happen is they didn't allow for that fear of failure to become the deterrent to make them walk away from their project. They made a determination because they had a goal of, this is something I really want to achieve. And though I failed at this and it seems like the cards might be stacked against me, I'm not going to stop. Imagine that. We wouldn't be in cars, in flight, and all kinds of other things if people just gave up that at the first crack at it, it didn't work. This is why I am so adamantly against, and I can be this way because I have not sired any children. I have no children whatsoever. I'm a man. I can't sire because I didn't birth any children. But I don't like the idea of everybody gets a trophy. I hate it. I hate it. Because if you never learn how to fail, if you don't learn how it's uncomfortable, if you don't learn that you hate the way that it feels, if everything is always, hey, because you know what? Giving everybody a trophy creates a false illusion that you're equal. And in the world, we are not equal in a lot of ways. That conversation is way too deep. But when you make a child believe that, well, you get something even though you didn't do as much as the other person, you're not as good at this as this person, but it doesn't matter. You are setting them up for failure. And that failure will turn into fear because once they move past that point of that blissfulness of being able to be part of what you felt was belonging, and then you realize it's not like that in the real world, now you have actually created fear for them to legitimately try. And people step back. And that's when people end up in the back seat or shotgun. Because fear is a verb, and they are afraid to even try. This can be tied into sometimes even in situations with trauma. Trauma is a different conversation with fear. So I want to kind of put a footnote on that when we start talking about anything trauma related, this is a different type of conversation because when we look at counseling and trauma and crisis management, we approach it differently. There isn't a conversation just about fear. Because we know at the root of what's going on with that person, when there is fear, we know there's a reason for why. So the approach with someone who is experiencing trauma is different than someone who's experiencing fear and maybe doesn't know why, but maybe there's trauma and they don't know it yet. But when we know there is a trauma, that's a different type of fear. And that conversation really is a lot different with those people. So let's have a real talk time too. I told you, the real talk time and the toolbox time would go hand in hand today. And I just talked about children a lot because I feel this is where fear can really be diffused. So we talked about it being a deterrent or a determinant, but how can we make it diffused if it's starting to grow? It's interesting because one of the things I want you to learn and put into your toolbox is we're learning how to be curious or when to be apprehensive versus being fearful. So this is kind of like rewiring your internal conversation. Remember I told you it's absolutely okay to talk to yourself? I would probably advise don't do it out in public. That's the one kind of footnote I'd put on this because people might think you're kind of cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. But at the same time, people walk around with earpieces in now, so they may not. They don't know what to think. They just know you're talking to yourself. So you might be able to get away with it unless it seems a little bit too involved. So I'd probably say do it in the privacy of your home. Talk to yourself. Talk to yourself in the mirror. Write down the thoughts that you have. I want your internal conversation to change with yourself. I want us to rewire how we think about fear. I want us to reclaim the idea of curiosity, which as adults we tend to lose over time because we become jaded with the world. And apprehensiveness, what that means. Because apprehensiveness can kind of mean fear and anxiety, but it also can mean an understanding of a situation. So it's about perspective. So let's talk a bit about relearning how to be curious. I want us to become eager to know or learn something. This comfort zone conversation, I've talked about it a couple times throughout the show. Go back to episode 24 and listen to the security and sabotage of comfort zones. Because fear, at the root of it, is so much enmeshed with the whole conversation about comfort zone. And sometimes the comfort zone you're even in is not even a good one, real talk. I'm gonna be honest. Most people's comfort zones aren't necessarily the best place, but it's the only place they know. So like, I'm gonna stay here even if this is not the best situation to necessarily be in, because right now I feel like this is the best place for me to be, and I know it. And I know it. Go back and check out that episode, because to me, it gives a lot of credence to understanding where fear, because moving out of comfort zones is totally incumbent about fear. And that's why this first conversation came in, because I want us to relearn the idea of curiosity, opposed to saying, there is something out there that I know nothing about, the fear of the unknown. Before you decide to write it off because you don't know about it, ask yourself why you're writing it off. Be like, well, but that might be different. Have you ever been afraid to do something like, this is interesting because I might push myself this way. I said that I will never like skydive. I'm never going to bungee jump. I don't want to dangle from that's okay. That gives me another thought pattern. But I've always said I would never skydive. I'm like, that just seems to me to be crazy. But I might rethink that and challenge myself, because I feel like it's something that I can't control. But people who do it say it can be a huge adrenaline rush. Not a bad thing. I'm willing to challenge myself because it's something I said I absolutely will not do because I'm really afraid of it. But what's worse going to happen? Well, I guess the parachute could not open. But, when you have to jump with a pro, then it's going to open. So I think. No. But seriously, I want people to learn how to rediscover being curious as we were as children. Remember, curiosity is the thing with children that helps them to learn. Now, mind you, I will tell you, there is curiosity killed the cat. I have cats. I totally know why this saying is around. Curiosity doesn't mean being stupid. It does not mean that you're going to ignore something is dangerous for the sake of doing it. That's not what the curiosity I want you to have. I want to say, when you legitimately have things in your life that you are fearful of, I want you to consider asking yourself the question, interject curiosity into the fear. Like, why am I afraid of this? Ask yourself that. The other piece to that that's equally as important is the apprehensive piece. So be eager to get out of your comfort zone. Call into question what you're afraid of with a sense of curiosity. Remove fear and replace it with curiosity. Like, I'm afraid to do that because of this is that. And say, that piques my interest because that's something I don't know much about. Do you see how that internal conversation is different? Opposed to creating a statement of fear. I'm afraid to do that because I think this is going to happen. You instead say, that's an interesting situation I don't know much about, and there's some pieces of it that I really need to learn more about because it makes me a little bit uncomfortable, but I'm curious to why that is. Internal conversations become self-directive. And that's why I keep telling people you can never do enough internal conversations with yourself. How you decide to dress something up and take it out is totally up to you about your perception. The other piece is, we talked about relearning how to be curious. The next piece is about apprehension, which, by the way, can mean fear and anxiety. But I want to use more of the second meaning of it, which is there's levels of difficulty to being in uncomfortable situations. Understanding and grasping that, what makes you uneasy and what makes you afraid, is really key. So hence, this really gets back to that internal conversation that I talked about and said, hey, it's how you decide to look at the thing that makes you, new language, uncomfortable, not afraid, and say, this makes me uneasy because, 1, I don't know enough about this. 2, I may not know what's going to happen if that happens. So ultimately, it's the fear of the unknown, or it's not knowing about the unknown that's making me really uncomfortable. Okay, now let's start doing some deductive reasoning and say, well, what's the possible outcomes? Because life is full of not knowing outcomes. That's why the thing about fear, I think, is interesting. Everything we do on a regular basis has outcomes that you have no idea what's going to happen. When you get in your car and drive to work, you have no idea what could happen on the way there. But you assume the outcome is you will arrive and get out your car and go into work. But when has it ever happened that, 1, you got pulled over for speeding? That was an outcome of driving to work you didn't expect. Or you get into a fender bender. That was an outcome you didn't expect from work. Or all of a sudden, there's new construction that wasn't there the day before. That was an outcome that you didn't expect. So life is full of uncertainty and outcomes. But the problem is, when we stay in our comfort zones, when they're presented to us, we don't know what to do with them. Because what do I say all the time? Humans are totally immersed in the idea of convenience, comfort, and control. And when you start negating those things for some people, they don't do well with it. And fear is something that is so easy to get locked into. So learn about being apprehensive opposed to fearful, another approach. This is uncomfortable. Let me grasp an understanding about why it's uncomfortable. Why is this making me feel like this? And be honest with yourself, because that's part of the internal conversation. There's no need to lie to you. I'll be honest, that's denial and repression and all kinds of things that Freud talked about. When you stop lying to yourself, that's when you know the change has come. You're like, I'm just going to stop trying to sugarcoat this to make it good, because I'm not making it good for me. So when you can have that moment of truth with you, that's when you know you made a great shift. And I'm not saying you're a full-blown liar to yourself. I'm just saying sometimes we tend to sugarcoat things to make it more palatable. That's just real talk. Nobody wants to deal with difficult stuff most of the time. So we try to make it a lot more easier to deal with, which then sometimes creates a bigger issue because we just weren't honest with ourselves about what was really happening. You can do something and full well know that coming down the pipeline is going to be a consequence that you don't like. But people will try to turn their head the opposite way and act like it's not coming. Oh, but when it comes, it hits them like a ton of bricks. And they're like, oh my God, it's like, stop. You knew this was coming when you did it. That's being honest and accountability. Other things that have to be in your toolbox. So let's get back to being curious and learn how to substitute fear with being a bit more apprehensive, because we want to create an understanding. So how can you diminish your fears? And I think this part is really important. This gets back to, remember, the thing about objectivity. And when we use that out of our toolbox, it all comes down to look, listen, and evaluate. Something I want you to start doing all the time along with your emotional intelligence. Before you can even deal with fear, look, listen, and evaluate, you have to acknowledge that it's there. Denial, repression, there's so many things that Freud talked about, in his psychosocial dynamics. And it's called ego mechanisms. The better term for it, if you want to take Freud out of it, is defense mechanisms. Things that people do. It's interesting because maybe I should do an episode on that. Like, are you using one of these defense mechanisms and how this absolutely is not healthy for you? Maybe it'll be next week. I kind of love the psychology of things, because often people will be like, damn, that's me 100. I do that all the time, but not realizing how debilitating the behavior can be. So maybe next week we'll talk about defense mechanisms, and maybe you employ one defense mechanism more so than you do another, depending on the situation. But I also feel when you become enlightened about something, then all of a sudden you might start checking yourself before you wreck yourself. Because you'll be like, I just think I just sat there and did some straight denial. And then you'll go, thanks, M.A.Y.A. But really, you must acknowledge before you can do anything that I have a fear of this. That's the first step. The next thing you're going to move into, once you acknowledge, because we're still doing the look, listen, and evaluate piece, is say to yourself, I know that knowing better doesn't always mean we do better, because that's one of those old sayings. When you know better, you do better. That's lying to yourself, because I can say it. There's plenty of times I knew something and still did the wrong thing. There's something about human nature that will absolutely get us off on the wrong track. Even when we're fully aware of a situation, sometimes we cannot seem to get off the train. Even when we know where the train is going, and when it pulls into that station, we already know that's not the station we want to be at. But do we stop it? Do we get off where we know we should? No, we just keep rolling. So I want to just take away that sayings that people say that aren't true. When we know better, we don't always do better, because we see it all the time. That's being honest with yourself. Like, I knew I shouldn't have did that, but I did it anyways. But here's what's key. When you know something, while we're working at doing better, let's start having that internal conversation, and let's ask ourselves, why do I fear this? Learn the source of the fear. For some people, this could unlock trauma. And I'm going to tell you something. One of the things that I've said repeatedly in different episodes is people have been traumatized in ways they didn't understand. There's big trauma, there's little trauma. We call it big T, little t. It's interesting. And in some societies and in some cultures, trauma is ingrained within the very society and culture that it almost is neutralized, and people are they're numb to it, and it's normalized, which is scary. And right now, I could put that conversation in so many areas right now in society where trauma has been normalized. And that's dangerous, because it goes in places and it creates issues and problems that tend to be very generational, truth be told. But we're talking about the immediate, like right here and now impact. Trauma is never a good thing. But if you don't even know that you were under such a duress that has affected you on an emotional and mental, often physical, spiritual, the whole 9 yards way, you just keep acting like everything is normal because you've come to expect that. Some people have a different fear response. Some people don't fear things that they should, which is interesting. Whole nother conversation within itself. So look, listen, evaluate. I want you to say, hey, you know what? Why do I fear this? And learn the source. Was it because the way I was raised told me to behave this way, that this was something I should fear? You know, it's interesting. We, for instance, tell small children, don't talk to strangers. And I agree with that. Children should not talk to strangers, especially when they're not old enough to discern if it's not safe. But that also, for some people, becomes very debilitating because they don't know sometimes how to differentiate when it is safe to talk to people or when it's not. In today's world, that within itself can be complicated. Seriously. But think about it. So the fear of socializing for some people, when a parent maybe became really overbearing and were legitimately like helicopter parents and never allowed their child to develop that independence to be able to get into the world, there often is a fear of interacting with people. Not that I want to seem Freudian and I keep reverting back to childhood talk, but our childhood is the basis of so much that we do as adults. So being able to reconcile these things and to get to the core of why you struggle with something or why you're fearful, it may take you back that far. It may go back maybe just to your teenage years. An incident happened that created this response from you. So it just really depends. But it's important to get to the source no matter where the source is. The source could have come from you just being married and something happened within that situation that now has made you fearful. Something could have happened to you at your job that now you have a fear of this. I have people that I've talked to that because they've had situations at their place of employment that they really weren't doing something wrong, but the way they were treated and there was no justice and no resolution. So when they're in that situation and now they're afraid to even address when there's an issue because of how they were treated, and or they have moved on to another place of employment and absolutely will not address things and just try to walk the straight and narrow out of fear that if they express something that's wrong, there will be a repercussion for them. That's that condition, that learned behavior. That can be really dangerous. So how you look at things and how you proceed with things, it takes time. And sometimes maybe you do need to talk to someone else to help you to navigate things if it becomes that complicated. The next thing is about look, listen, and evaluate. Challenge yourself in small ways. I don't want people to be like gangbusters. I'm kicking in the door. I'm taking fear on. No. It didn't take just one moment to create this fear for you to the point to where it is. The initial incident may have happened, and over time it snowballed and things compounded it. So hence, we're not going to deconstruct it and address it all in one swoop. That's not what this show is about. It's about being honest about what's in front of you. And I like for people to try to be more incremental in their adjusting. And I've said this again, no, trauma, you may want to get help with your fear if you've really discovered something that you didn't know. Because when you unpack trauma, I'm going to tell you, a lot of people have it. It can be the most unhinging thing that you've ever experienced. And sometimes people are so shameful. They're so afraid to ask for help. If nothing else, if you've unpacked trauma, I want you to think back. And M.A.Y.A said, one of the strongest things you could ever do is ask for help. There's somebody there who will help you. I'm here. So never be afraid when something comes to the surface that you were unaware of, out of your unconscious, so to speak. Never be afraid to address it and to ask for help, because when you don't, you then give that situation power, control, and now you live in fear. Those are such key things that I think are so hard for people to navigate. So, one of the things I want to get into is a final thought of the show. 1, find fear's antithesis. You have to find the balance in what makes you afraid. Part of being able to move forward, and this is really big, let's say you struggle with, let's use success as an example. Find that antithesis to that fear of success. So here's how we work incrementally at this. Go back and think about the things you were successful at. And when you do that, look at the situation from what was the support you had, what was the environment you were in, what were the skill sets you had that lended to it, how did that all work towards you being successful? Then look at the thing that you're afraid of and do that assessment. Do I have the skill? Do I have the support? And is this the environment that's going to help me to be able to achieve that success? And if you're answering no to any of those things, now you know what you need to challenge. I need this thing in place for me to be able to get here. There's no reason to forge into something if you're not prepared to do it, because part of addressing fear is willing to be prepared to deal with it. It's not going in guns a-blazing and hoping for the best. No, it's going in the best possible situation with the tools and resource and support that you need to be able to address it. What's interesting is you often don't have to face fear alone. In a lot of group therapy situations, people will go, okay, I'm so glad to know I'm not the only person who felt like that I'm not alone in being afraid of that. There's power in numbers. There's power in having proper resources around you. It's the thing that empowers you. So never try to approach fear without understanding what the antithesis of it is. You must know that. It's key. And my final thought for this, final thought, it's been my favorite saying forever. I pulled this from Pitbull, who pulled it from somebody else. And it says, fear is this: forget everything and run, or face everything and rise. You ultimately make the choice of what direction that you want to go when we talk about fear. That's powerful. But if you've been in that face and run, but you're ready to rise, no, you don't have to rise alone. That's what's key about this. That's why you come to M.A.Y.A hopefully every single week, so you can get some tidbits of things that can help you to feel empowered, to getting to that best version of yourself and harnessing happiness on a daily basis. All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the show. Make sure, call to action, you subscribe to my YouTube channel, M.A.Y.A. You can find episodes there. Of course, if you happen to have a podcast platform of choice, I won't hold it against you. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Audibles, so many places, Apple Podcasts. Just make sure you subscribe to me there as well. Remember, if you go to M.A.Y.A.com, because all episodes of my show is there will be a podcast companion for this episode as well. So a couple additional resources I've given to you to read, or sometimes a video that I think can help you to really start to dig a little deeper into the conversation, because this is a really deep conversation. So there's always additional and supplemental things that you can use on the show. Thank you for tuning in, Brandy Harris. Thank you so much. I always appreciate your support and your input. People make me better too, all the time. I love getting feedback from people and watching people's journey, because it lets me know, hey, you know what? What I'm doing may not be touching thousands of people, but if I'm changing the life of one person, to me, that's great value. So I take it one person at a time, and we take the journey together. And who knows, down the road, there could be thousands of us walking that path to being the best versions of ourselves and harnessing happiness. But here's what's key: on our terms, not on somebody else's. That's what being the best version of you and harnessing happiness is all about. All right, everybody. Until next time, remember, your present becomes your past, and your future is no more. So live every single day to the absolute fullest. With that being said, be well, stay safe, and of course, you're always blessed. Ciao.
Get inspired, get motivated with M.A.Y.A and the M.A.Y.A, My Ambition, Your Ambition podcast.
Something that I take pride in is trying to be forward thinking, thinking outside the box, challenging myself. And as I challenge myself, hopefully I challenge you.
Find M.A.Y.A on Twitter and Instagram at M.A.Y.A_Akai. On Facebook at M.A.Y.A Akai Presents.
We're going to talk health, wealth, fitness, mental health, financial, lots of different things that can empower you as you seek out the ambition that you're pursuing.
Or get everything M.A.Y.A at M.A.Y.A Akai.com.